Hi, my name is Bob Ricks, and in this video we're going to build a sheet with custom workflow. Now what I mean by custom workflow is a sheet that you fill out, and when you submit it, it routes to some sequence of people, but instead of it just being predetermined by the configuration of the sheet, you, as a programmer, are customizing the workflow according to the information that a person put on the sheet when they submitted it. So that's why we're calling it a custom workflow, and we're going to show you today how to set that up. What we're going to do as a way of an example is we're going to start with a sheet an accounting person would use to get invoices paid. This is called an invoice approval form, but keep in mind that this electronic sheet here could have been a purchase order or a timesheet or any sheet that had some sort of workflow, meaning some sort of routing to a sequence of users who need to approve or sign off on a document. What we're going to do today is spotlight the elements on a sheet as a programmer that you would have to modify to customize the workflow, meaning to change it to what it should be when the person's filling it out and submitting it. The first thing we'll do is we're going to go ahead and take a look at a sheet and how you make sure that it does workflow in general. We'll look at all the main options that you have when you set up workflow. Then we'll look at the elements that are related to changing the workflow on the fly when you're on the sheet. In other words, there's going to be a cell that has the routing table in it that you're going to be able to modify through your programming. And we're going to show you what that is and how to modify it. And we're going to use a specific example. The example that we're going to use today is a script that adds an extra approver if the invoice that's being requested to sign off on has a very high amount. So for example, the workflow out of the box might route to, let's say, 2 people, but what we're going to do is we're going to customize it so that if the amount exceeds some threshold, we'll add a 3rd approver to it. So let's get started. Let's look at the overall aspects of setting up workflow on a sheet. There are 3 things that are important. Number 1, the behavior type of the sheet. So let me go ahead and pull up the page designer, and you'll see there's a design type. The design type of a sheet must be storage, because otherwise there is no workflow. The non-storage and back-end sheets don't have workflow, so it's only the storage sheet. So if you're setting up workflow, it's got to be a storage sheet. Number 2 is the flow options themselves. So this flow options is available to you on all storage sheets. When you click on that, there's a number of things that you're going to want to look at. Number 1, you're going to want to set up, if you don't already have, and a flow for the sheet. If this item isn't here, you just click new and you'll set that up. When you click on that, there's a couple things to look at. The most important is the sharing type. This sharing type, if you're going to have sequential workflow, meaning you fill out the form and it goes to person A and then it goes to person B and then to person C, that sharing type has to be one of these down here. It cannot be this option at the top called share and reply. This option at the top, it's really for sharing that's used in email-like situations. When you're talking about workflow where it goes to a sequence of users, you want to use one of these down here. The 3rd thing you're going to want to look at is routing. There are 2 kinds of routing, predefined and user-defined. Predefined routing just means that when a person is on the form and they submit it, the system already knows it's going to go to this person and this other person, for example. It's been predefined. User-defined, however, is different. If a person fills out a sheet and they click the send button, if it's user-defined, they can actually choose who it routes to. In a typical workflow like timesheets and purchase orders and invoice approval requests and things of that nature, you typically want it to be predefined, but there are scenarios where user-defined may come in handy. In our example, we're going to have predefined routing. So that's approval flow in a nutshell. The next topic we need to cover is how to modify the approval flow. The way approval flow works is when you first enter this form, the approval flow, if it's predetermined, is already available to you, at least internally, in a variable called WE, which is called the to cell. That cell contains the approval flow for the form that's out of the box before you've made modifications to it. So let's go ahead and show you how you can see that. To do that, we can just go into a cell calculation in any cell. I'm going to go into one over here. And we're just going to write a function called console WE. This function console, it'll actually put the value of a variable or a cell in a pop-up on the screen in the console. We want to look at WE. This console function has 2 arguments. The second argument is just a little label that goes in the pop-up that we see in the console. And in addition to seeing the value that we have in WE that is initialized when we're on this particular sheet, why don't we also find out about how that little table of information is structured, and we can use the info function for that. We just have to say info of WE. That'll tell us how that WE cell is structured, what goes in each column and so on. So I want to hit done. the screen, and if I run it, there's my pop-up. So the console function gave me a table of information. It looks like that table has 4 columns. 1, 2, that might be the step. This might be the user. 2 looks like who we're routing it to, and false. I believe that's related to, well, this routing table actually isn't live yet. We haven't actually submitted it, so therefore this column is false. But just to see that, since we had in our macro used the function info, that info returns a description of how that table is structured. So over here, you'll see that the first column has a step number. So the step number in any kind of workflows is the sequence number, meaning step 1, one person gets notified. Once they approve, in step 2 would be the next person, and so on. So the first column of this table is the step number. The second is the user, and you'll see a little 1 over here. That's just the user's ID. So in column 2 is the user ID of the user who needs to approve the sheet. Number 3 is a type, and if I look at reference 2, possible values are 2 or CC. 2 means that person that we're sending it to needs to approve or reject it. CC means, well, we're also going to give a little CC notice, a little carbon copy notice to another user. They wouldn't actually have the ability to approve or reject it, but at least they'd get a copy. The 4th, which is whether it's approved or not, well, that's why we saw the false earlier, is true or false, but we're not going to set whether it's approved. We just really want to set the first 3 columns. That's all we're going to want to do. So now you see how the approval flow is structured. To create a custom approval flow, what we want to do is take this table, meaning this approval flow that was predetermined when we entered the form in the beginning, and then add lines to it or take lines away, because whatever this table of information is, when the user hits send, it's going to use that table and use that to determine what the workflow of that sheet is. So what we want to do is we want to modify this table, at least for this example, and add a line to the approval flow table in the event that the total invoice approval request is over $1,000. That's what we're going to do today. So to go ahead and do that, we're going to have to set up a calculation. So let's go ahead and customize WE. What I've done is I've actually written a program already so that if the invoice is over $1,000, I've gone ahead and put 8,000 in here, then it will add an approver. So I'm going to go ahead, I've added that to the cell calculation in this cell. Put a cell calculation, and there's my routine that I wrote. So what I did is I set up a variable, max amount equals 1,000. I put it at the top of the script here so that if you want to add it using a different threshold, you could just change it up here instead of having to go into the code to change it. I did the same thing here. There's a APP ID with the approver ID. I put 1,000. Actually, you could put the user ID of any approver in here so that that would indicate the user that you're going to add to the routing table in the event that it goes over this threshold that we see here. I put a little line here, console WE, just to see what the routing table looks like before we modify it. Okay, now I added a little if statement. If summary of BG. So this column here, that's BG, and the summary value is, you can get that just with the value, with a function called summary. So if you say summary of BG, that just gives you the amount here, which is the total on the invoice approval request. If it's larger than max amount, which we set to 1,000 above, then we're going to do a number of things. We're going to calculate the next step. If you recall, that table had in a column a step number, and if we want to, we could just put step 3, but when you set it up, there could be any number of steps. We just want to find out how many steps it has and then add 1 to it, and we just added this line over here to accomplish that. We just said my step equals max call WE1. That means look at the value in the table WE. Look in column 1, find its maximum value. So this will give you the value. If there's only 1 line, it would be 1. If there was 2 lines, it would be 2. And then just add 1 to it. So that'll get me the step that we want to add to it. Then the row that we want to add to the table is called my row equals. And we can create a row just using a command called row, where every argument to the row command is just the elements of the different cells. So the first one was my step. That was the first column. Next was the approver ID, my approver, which we set at the top of this script. The third one was 2. Another possible value is CC if you just want to CC a person, but in this case 2 just means that's the next approver. And then the 4th column is false because it hasn't been approved. So that's the value of my row. The next thing that we need to do is just append that row to the existing table, to WE. And to do that, you just say WE equals append, WE my row. Just takes the old table, WE, adds my row to it. So we just put that inside of an if statement, so it only occurs, of course, when the value here exceeds the max amount. Below that, put a little line console WE my routing table after. So if we run this, we can see what the routing table looks like before this script ran and then also after. So let's go ahead and run that. We'll go here. So there's the routing table that we have beforehand. And if I hit next, that's the one after it. Now it looks like this third one element here is error because I actually never set the user ID. So let me go ahead and take a look at that. So here's max amount 1000, app ID is 1000. We have a row. Oh, this is my approver, not app ID. Well, that's actually a typo, and that's why we had the value error in there. So let me just fix that. That there, app ID. There's app ID. By the way, as a trick in programming, if you highlight something and then cut and paste it, then you know that you haven't made a typo. Let's save again. Let's run this again. This is the before, writing table before. This is after, and there's our 1000. Now, the user 1000 and that ID you can actually get when you look at the users in the system. So I'm going to show you how we can do that. So if I go back over here and look at tools and look at the user database that's in your account, let's say I wanted to have that extra approver be this John Jackson over here. I could just open that up, go down at the bottom, and there users :1142. The users, that's the name of the design. The document ID, which is the user ID, is 1142. So actually 1142 would be John Jackson. So if I went back into this invoice approval macro, then I could just set, instead of that being 1000, I could set it to 1142. And that would mean that John Jackson would be the extra approver if it hit 1000. If I were to set this to 10,000, by the way, just as an exercise here, since this only has 8,000, then the before and after should be the same since it would never hit the 8,000. So let's just go ahead and play around with that and see if it does that as we would expect. And so our first is before, our after is the same as we would expect. So we've just created a macro that actually will take the approval flow and add an approver to it if the value on this invoice approval request exceeds a certain threshold that we dictate in there. So what we've done is we've actually created a custom approval flow. The last step is to take this macro and actually have it work when you send the invoice approval. So the way to do that is we would just go into this cell calculation, grab the entire cell calculation, put it in my buffer, also delete it out of here at the same time. And then we have to apply it to the send. So to do that, go to the Page Designer Extensions Calculations, and then there's a calculation called Action Button Calculations. And if I go in here and choose the send, I can actually run the macro before sending it. So I can actually paste it in here, hit done. Now I actually have, okay, let me go ahead and make sure that I enable it. On. Done. Now you see that it's on. So we actually have a macro that gets run when you send it, and we're done. We now have a custom approval flow. If you have any questions or suggestions, leave us a comment below or send us a message on our customer support line. We're here to make your operations great.